Ethan Cole woke up earlier than usual that morning. He was a man who liked quiet mornings, the kind where the world still felt calm before the rush of the day began. He padded into the kitchen in his slippers, switched on the coffee maker, and leaned against the counter, listening to the steady drip of the machine. After years of serving in the Navy, his body still carried the habit of rising early, but now his mornings were slower, gentler. He enjoyed the peace of his suburban neighborhood, the sound of birds outside, and the simple routine of coffee and toast. He had just poured himself a mug when he heard a loud, sudden pounding on his front door. It was not a polite knock but a forceful thud that echoed through the house. He froze for a second, wondering if it was an emergency. The pounding came again, followed by voices loud, commanding voices shouting, "You're in violation." Ethan frowned and set his coffee down. He walked to the door, opened it slowly, and found two men standing on his porch. They wore dark polo shirts with the words "Community Compliance" stitched on the chest and badges that looked official but didn't belong to any real police department. One of them, tall with a sharp jawline, leaned forward and said in a harsh tone, "Sir, you're in violation of community code. You need to fix this immediately." Ethan stayed calm, though his brow furrowed. "Violation? What violation are you talking about?" he asked. The second man, shorter and stockier, waved a clipboard in front of him. "Your fence is above the permitted height, and you've got an unapproved fixture on your wall. This is not allowed here. You've already been fined." Ethan blinked. He had lived in this neighborhood for years, and his fence hadn't changed since he moved in. The fixture they were pointing at was nothing more than a small bracket holding his American flag. "I've received no notice," Ethan replied evenly. "Can you show me where it says this is a violation?" The tall man crossed his arms. "We don't need to explain the code to you. You'll get the paperwork later. The fine stands. If you don't comply, further action will be taken." A neighbor across the street had come out to water her plants and was now watching the scene unfold. Another had quietly pulled out a phone and was recording. Ethan noticed both, but he stayed focused. Years of Navy training had taught him that raising his voice solved nothing. Calm words and clear questions worked far better. "I understand," Ethan said slowly, "but I'll need something in writing." "What's your name?" He looked at the tall man first. The man stiffened. "You don't need my name. Just know you're in violation." "And yours?" Ethan asked the shorter one. Neither gave their names. Instead, the taller one scribbled something on a paper, tore it off, and shoved it into Ethan's hand. The slip showed a large fine with no explanation, no bylaw reference, no appeal information. It looked rushed and almost careless. Ethan folded the paper without arguing. "Thank you," he said politely. "I'll review this with the board directly." The men looked at each other, surprised that he wasn't rattled, then turned and walked down the porch. The taller one muttered something under his breath, but Ethan ignored it. He stood at the door watching them leave, then closed it quietly. Inside, he took a slow breath and set the slip of paper on the table. He picked up his phone and snapped photos of his fence and the flag bracket from different angles, making sure the time and date were visible. He also stepped outside and asked the neighbor across the street if she would mind sharing the video she had recorded. She agreed, saying softly, "They've been bothering a lot of people lately." Ethan thanked her and went back inside. He sat at his desk, opened his laptop, and wrote a short email to the HOA office. He requested the specific bylaw he had supposedly broken, the date of notice, and the process for appeal. Within minutes, an automated reply came back, "Thank you for your message. Your concern will be reviewed." Nothing more. He shook his head. Something wasn't right. He wasn't angry. Anger was never his first response, but he felt a determination rising. He had fought tougher battles in his life than an unclear fine from a homeowners association, but he also knew that small injustices, if ignored, could grow into bigger problems. He poured himself another cup of coffee and thought for a while. Then he reached for his phone and scrolled through his contacts. There were still a few numbers he kept close, old friends from his SEAL team. They weren't just warriors, each had built new careers after the service, in law, security, logistics, and community work. They knew how to solve problems with calm heads and strong principles. He tapped Noah's name first. Noah had been their logistics expert, the man who could map out supplies for a mission with mathematical precision. When Noah answered, his voice was warm. "Ethan, long time. What's going on?" Ethan chuckled. "I've got a situation that's less dramatic than our old missions, but it needs some strategy. My HOA just sent so-called compliance officers to my house. They claimed my fence and flag are violations. They gave me a fine with no details." Noah let out a low whistle. "Sounds shady. You want me to take a look?" "Yes," Ethan said. "But I don't want confrontation. I want this handled correctly, by the book." "You've called the right guy," Noah replied. "Let's pull in the others. We'll meet this weekend." By the time Ethan hung up, a small smile had appeared on his face. He wasn't smiling because he expected an easy fight. He was smiling because he knew he wasn't alone. His old teammates had always believed in solving problems the right way through preparation, patience, and discipline. Later that afternoon, he stepped outside again and walked the length of his fence, running his hand along the wood. It was sturdy, clean, and well kept. The flag bracket was simple and respectful, holding a flag that meant something personal to him. He thought of the irony, after years of serving his country, someone was now telling him that a small flag holder on his wall was a crime. But he wasn't discouraged. He had learned long ago that life was not about avoiding challenges, it was about facing them with honor. If the HOA had made a mistake, it would be corrected. If they had acted unfairly, the truth would come out. And if the community was being treated wrongly, then maybe it was time someone stood up, not with anger, not with fists, but with fairness and facts. That night, Ethan wrote everything down in his notebook: the time of the visit, the words they shouted, the slip of paper they gave, the photos he had taken, and the video he hoped to receive from his neighbor. He knew that a clear record was the first step toward justice. Before going to bed, he glanced once more at the fence outside his window. The moonlight fell across the yard, making everything look calm and normal. He smiled faintly. Tomorrow would bring more questions, but he was ready. He was not just a retired Navy SEAL, he was a man who believed in doing what was right, even when the challenge came from something as unexpected as a knock on the door. The weekend arrived, and Ethan kept his word. He drove to a small cafe downtown, a quiet place with wooden tables and the smell of fresh bread. Waiting inside were two men and a woman, all familiar faces from another life. They had served together in difficult times, and even though they had taken different paths after leaving the Navy, the bond remained strong. Noah, tall and thin with a calm voice, gave Ethan a firm handshake. "Still on time, as always," he said with a smile. Beside him was Jax, broader and younger, now working as a security consultant. His humor was quick, but he was sharp when it came to communication. Maya, Noah's wife, was also there. She had never served in the military, but she had been around their group long enough to understand the mindset. As a paralegal specializing in contracts, she had built her own reputation for detail and persistence. Ethan explained everything clearly: the pounding on the door, the shouting, the vague fine, and the lack of paperwork. He described the slip of paper and the unanswered email. He didn't exaggerate or dramatize, he simply laid out the facts. Maya leaned forward, tapping her notebook. "This doesn't sound like a lawful notice. If they want to enforce a rule, they need to cite the exact bylaw, explain the violation, and give a chance to respond. What you described is sloppy." Noah nodded. "And the way they showed up at your door," Acting like police? That's intimidation. It might work on some residents who don't know their rights. Jax crossed his arms. If they're running around shouting like that, they're leaving the HOA exposed. It only takes one recorded video to show a pattern, and then the board will have a problem. Ethan sipped his coffee slowly. That's why I called you all. I don't want this to become a shouting match. We need to handle it calmly and respectfully. If they've made mistakes, let's find them. If they've been unfair, let's prove it with evidence. I don't want to fight them, I want to show the truth. Maya's eyes lit up. Then let's start with records. Every HOA has to keep minutes of board meetings and contracts with vendors. You, as a homeowner, have a right to inspect them. I can draft a formal request. They'll have to give us copies. Noah pulled out a small notebook. We'll need a timeline. Start with the date they came to your house, then track every step: emails, replies, photos, videos. That way, nothing gets lost. Jax leaned back in his chair. And let's bring in the community. If this happened to you, chances are it's happening to others. I can set up a simple website where neighbors can share their stories. Nothing fancy, just a form they can fill in. We'll keep it anonymous if they want. Ethan felt a wave of relief. These weren't just old teammates, they were problem solvers. He realized that while he had been ready to stand alone, he didn't have to. Together, they could create a plan that was firm but peaceful, professional yet human. That evening, Ethan walked door to door, speaking with his neighbors. He didn't complain or spread anger. Instead, he asked gentle questions. Have you had any unexpected finds? Did anyone come to your door? Some nodded quietly, others shook their heads, but a few leaned in with frustration. One elderly couple said they had been fined for having flower pots outside their porch, even though they had been there for years. Another man explained that he had received a violation for parking his truck slightly past the driveway line, though no one had warned him before. Several people admitted they had paid fines simply to avoid trouble, even though they weren't sure they had broken any rules. Ethan listened patiently, never interrupting. He wrote notes and asked if they would be comfortable sharing their stories through the survey Jax was creating. Many agreed, relieved to know someone was taking the lead. Within days, the website began filling up with entries. Residents described rushed visits, unclear notices, and confusing rules. Some shared copies of fines that looked almost identical to Ethan's slip: no bylaw references, no appeal instructions, just a large fee. Patterns began to appear. Meanwhile, Maya drafted a polite but firm letter. It requested copies of the HOA meeting minutes from the past year, contracts with the compliance vendor, and the list of citations issued on Ethan's street. She made sure the language was professional, citing state law that required HOAs to provide such records. Ethan printed the letter, signed it, and delivered it in person to the HOA office. The receptionist looked surprised but accepted it. Ethan smiled kindly and said, "Thank you for your help. I'll wait for your reply." Back at home, Noah spread a large board on Ethan's dining table. He marked dates, taped copies of emails, and pinned photos. This way, he explained, we can see the full picture at a glance. It reminded Ethan of mission boards from years ago, but now instead of maps and targets, it was community bylaws and HOA letters. Jax prepared flyers with a simple message: have you had an unclear fine? Share your story. Visit this website. Ethan helped him hand them out at the local park and post them on community bulletin boards. They were not accusing anyone, they were only inviting people to talk. The response was even stronger than expected. Within a week, dozens of residents had shared their experiences. Some were minor, some more serious, but nearly all revealed confusion or frustration. Ethan felt the weight of their trust. These were his neighbors, people who just wanted to live peacefully, and now they were looking to him for guidance. One night, as Ethan reviewed the new entries, he paused at a story from a single mother. She described how the compliance officers had come to her door in the evening, when she was alone with her young daughter. They had spoken harshly, leaving her frightened. She had paid the fine immediately, even though she didn't understand the violation. Reading her words, Ethan felt a quiet determination harden inside him. This isn't about me anymore, he thought. It's about everyone here. He shared the entry with his teammates the next day. Jax shook his head. That's exactly the kind of behavior that gets organizations into real trouble. Maya added, if they've been contracting a company that profits from issuing fines, we might find a serious conflict of interest. That's not just unfair, it could be unlawful. Noah pointed to the board. Then our next step is clear. We visit the HOA office together. Not with anger, not with threats. With documents, questions, and solutions. Ethan agreed. We'll go respectfully, during business hours. We'll dress neat, carry copies, and keep everything polite. If they want to be fair, they'll welcome it. If they don't, the truth will still stand. As the evening ended, the four of them stood together in Ethan's living room. The air felt lighter, not because the problem was solved, but because they had a path forward. They weren't preparing for a fight, they were preparing for clarity, honesty, and fairness. Ethan looked at each of them with gratitude. We always said we'd have each other's backs, he said quietly. I didn't think it would be for something like this. But I'm glad you're here. Noah smiled. Doesn't matter what the mission is, old friend. The principle's the same. We protect what's right. And so, with notes, letters, and careful plans, they set the stage for what would come next, a calm but powerful visit to the HOA headquarters. The following week was busy for Ethan and his small team. Each day seemed to bring new information, and with every new piece, the picture became clearer. The website Jax had built was filling quickly with stories from neighbors. Some were only a few lines long, others full paragraphs, but together they formed something powerful. One resident wrote about being fined for a garden chair on her porch, even though it had been there for years. Another complained that he had been charged for a lawn violation even after paying for a landscaping service approved by the HOA itself. Many admitted they had simply paid to avoid trouble, even though they didn't fully understand what they had done wrong. Jax sat at Ethan's dining table one evening, scrolling through the submissions on his laptop. Look at this, he said, turning the screen. We've got over 50 responses in less than a week. That's not small. This is a pattern. Ethan leaned closer. And the language is almost identical in the fines. No bylaw numbers, no instructions for appeal, just payment demands. Maya, flipping through a folder of printed minutes, added, and here's the interesting part. The HOA board approved a contract with a compliance company about 6 months ago. It was voted on during a special meeting. The notice for that meeting was barely 24 hours, and hardly anyone attended. She tapped the page with her pen. The contract pays the company a base fee, but also gives them a per enforcement action payment. That means the more violations they issue, the more money they make. No wonder they're running around like this. Noah adjusted his glasses and added another note to the timeline board. So they're financially rewarded for writing as many citations as possible. That explains why even harmless things like flowerpots and chairs are being targeted. Ethan listened quietly, his jaw tightening slightly. He had faced tougher enemies before, but what troubled him now was how this was affecting ordinary families who just wanted peace in their homes. This is wrong, he said firmly. Neighbors shouldn't feel like prisoners in their own yards. The next day, Ethan received a text message from the elderly couple he had spoken to earlier. They had received another fine, this time for their mailbox, which was the same style as everyone else's. They were scared it could turn into a lien if they didn't pay. Ethan drove over to see them, bringing Jax along. The couple showed him the slip of paper. Once again, there was no reference to a bylaw. Just a demand for money. "Don't pay it," Ethan said gently. "Keep this paper safe. We'll handle it." The husband looked relieved. The wife gave Ethan a grateful smile. "We didn't know what to do. Thank you for standing up for us." Back at his home, Ethan added the fine to his growing folder. The evidence was stacking high. It was no longer about one unfair notice. It was about a system that had slipped into abuse. Maya prepared a second letter, this one more direct. She requested not just minutes and contracts, but also the number of enforcement actions taken by the vendor since the contract began. She cited state law again, reminding the board that records must be available to members upon request. Days later, a packet arrived in Ethan's mailbox. Inside were photocopies of the contract and a list of actions carried out by the compliance officers. The number shocked even Ethan. In just 6 months, over 300 citations had been issued in a community of fewer than 200 homes. Some households had been fined multiple times. Noah studied the numbers. "This doesn't make sense. Unless every family here is suddenly breaking rules every week, something's wrong." Maya pointed to a section of the contract. "And here it is, the vendor gets $50 per citation. That's on top of their monthly pay. That explains everything." Jax frowned. "This isn't just sloppy work. This is a business model built on punishment." Ethan rubbed his forehead. "The residents are the ones paying for this. Every fine is money taken from families. This isn't community protection, it's profit." The more they studied, the more problems they uncovered. The contract had been signed without proper member approval. The amendment to the fence bylaw, the one they had accused Ethan of breaking, had been changed quietly, without proper notice. According to state law, such changes required homeowner ratification, but no one in the neighborhood remembered being asked to vote. "This is bigger than a mistake," Maya said. "It's a violation of trust." One evening, the four of them gathered again at Ethan's house. The living room table was covered with papers, contracts, meeting minutes, surveys, and photos. The board on the wall looked like something from their old missions, filled with lines connecting events and dates. Ethan stood and looked at it all. "We've got what we need. But we don't use this to embarrass anyone. We use it to fix things." Jax grinned. "You're still the calm one, even after all these years." Ethan smiled faintly. "Calm is how we win." They decided the next step was to prepare a presentation. Not a speech of anger, but a clear explanation with evidence. Maya drafted slides in plain language, the pattern of fines, the vague citations, the poor enforcement payment in the vendor contract, the improper bylaw change, and the impact on residents. Jax polished the design so it looked professional. Noah organized the order, making sure it followed a timeline. Ethan prepared to speak simply, directly, and respectfully. In the days leading up to the visit to the HOA headquarters, Ethan continued to walk the neighborhood. People greeted him with gratitude. Some gave him copies of their fines, others shook his hand and wished him luck. The community was quietly uniting behind him. One evening, a young father stopped him on the sidewalk. "I heard what you're doing," he said. "My wife and I were thinking about moving because of all this stress. But now, maybe we'll stay. Thanks for standing up." Ethan nodded. "We're all in this together. It'll be okay." At night, Ethan sometimes sat alone with his thoughts. He wasn't a man who sought recognition. He didn't want to be the center of attention. He only wanted fairness. He thought of the single mother who had paid out of fear, the elderly couple who had worried about losing their home, and the neighbors who had stayed silent because they didn't know their rights. "This isn't just about me," he reminded himself. "This is about protecting everyone." On the morning of their planned visit to the HOA office, Ethan looked around his living room one last time. The board stood ready, the folders neatly stacked, the slides prepared. He dressed simply: shirt, tie, polished shoes. He wasn't going to war. He was going to speak the truth. His old teammates joined him, each carrying copies of the evidence. They greeted him with quiet confidence. The mission wasn't about strength or force. It was about fairness and dignity. As they left the house together, Ethan felt a calm sense of resolve. Whatever happened next, the HOA would see that the residents were not helpless. They had voices, they had rights, and they had the courage to stand together. The day of the visit arrived with quiet anticipation. Ethan woke early, his body still carrying the discipline of years in service. He prepared a simple breakfast, but his mind was already on the meeting ahead. Today was not about confrontation, it was about clarity. He reminded himself of that as he dressed neatly in a pressed shirt and tie, his shoes polished. He wanted to walk into the HOA office not as an enemy, but as a neighbor who believed in fairness. When Noah and Jax arrived, they too were dressed with care: dark suits, tidy hair, notebooks in hand. Maya carried a slim folder and her laptop bag. Together, they looked more like a professional consulting group than a band of former teammates. But that was the point. They wanted respect, not intimidation. On the drive to the HOA headquarters, which was located in a modest office park a few miles away, the car was quiet. Ethan finally spoke. "Remember," he said, "we don't argue. We don't raise voices. We just present what we have, clearly and respectfully. If they listen, we solve this. If they don't, the truth will still be on record." Maya nodded. "We'll keep it professional. They can't ignore facts presented in plain language." The headquarters was a two-story brick building with tinted windows. A small sign at the entrance read "Community Management Office." It looked ordinary, almost plain, but inside, important decisions about hundreds of families were made. Ethan led the way through the glass doors. At the reception desk, a woman greeted them politely. "Good morning. How can I help you?" Ethan smiled. "We're here to speak with the property manager and, if possible, a board member. We've prepared documents and a presentation that concern community enforcement practices." The woman looked uncertain but professional. "Do you have an appointment?" "No," Ethan said gently. "But this is important and directly related to homeowner rights. We'd appreciate even a few minutes of their time." She excused herself and disappeared into a hallway. A few minutes later, a man in his 50s with a neat suit and glasses came out. His nameplate read James Porter, property manager. He shook Ethan's hand briskly. "Mr. Cole? Please, come in." They followed him into a conference room with a long table and rows of chairs. A projector sat on one side, and the walls were lined with framed photos of the neighborhood. Not long after, two board members entered: a middle-aged woman with a firm expression and a younger man with cautious eyes. Ethan stood. "Thank you for meeting us. We won't take more time than necessary. We're here as residents, not as opponents. We simply want to address concerns with the enforcement process." James nodded, gesturing for them to sit. "Go ahead." Maya opened her laptop and projected the first slide. It showed a simple timeline: the day Ethan received his fine, the slip of paper he was handed, and the vague language it contained. "This is what started everything," she explained. "A fine with no bylaw reference, no appeal instructions, and no clear notice." The younger board member frowned slightly. "That doesn't look like our standard notice." Maya clicked to the next slide. It displayed excerpts from more than 20 similar fines collected from neighbors. Each one looked nearly identical: a vague violation and a demand for money. "This is not an isolated case," Maya said calmly. "We have over 50 documented examples from residents across the community." Jax then spoke, showing a chart. These are the responses we gathered through a community survey. The majority of residents reported feeling confused or intimidated by visits from compliance officers. Several reported being pressured to pay immediately, without clear explanations. The older board member shifted in her chair. Where did this data come from? From your community, Jax answered simply. Neighbors who want clarity and fairness. Noah stood next, pointing to a printed copy of the vendor contract. This is the contract with the compliance company, signed 6 months ago. It includes a base fee plus $50 for each enforcement action. That means the company earns more money the more citations they write. In just half a year, they issued over 300 citations in a neighborhood of fewer than 200 homes. He paused, letting the numbers sink in. That is not a reflection of widespread disobedience. That is a reflection of a system built on profit. The room fell quiet. The younger board member rubbed his chin, clearly unsettled. The property manager shifted uncomfortably. The older board member finally spoke. This is concerning. But rules are rules. Homeowners are expected to comply. Ethan leaned forward, his voice steady and calm. We respect rules. We respect standards. That's not the issue. The issue is process. Notices must be clear. Residents must be given proper appeals. And vendors should not be rewarded for punishing neighbors. That does not build a community, it divides it. He placed a folder on the table. Inside were copies of the contract, minutes of the meeting where it had been approved, and testimonies from residents. We are not asking for special treatment. We are asking for fairness. Suspend the questionable fines. Review the process. Amend the contract so enforcement is about community, not profit. The younger board member leaned back, thoughtful. He has a point, he murmured. James, the property manager, sighed. Perhaps we should consider adjustments. This incentive structure may not have been the best choice. The older board member looked defensive. We needed a way to ensure compliance. Maya answered firmly but respectfully. Compliance can be achieved with fairness and transparency. What we've seen here is neither. Ethan remained calm. We are not here to embarrass anyone. We are here to offer a solution. Hold an emergency meeting. Allow residents to speak. Let us work together to create a process that protects everyone, including the board. The board members exchanged glances. Finally, the younger one nodded. I think that's reasonable. An emergency open meeting. 14 days from now. James scribbled a note. We can make that happen. As the meeting ended, Ethan shook each hand firmly. Thank you for listening. That's all we ask. On their way out, a staff member quietly approached Ethan. Thank you, she whispered. Many of us have seen the complaints, but no one spoke up until now. Ethan only nodded. It's not about me. It's about all of us. When they stepped outside into the bright sunlight, Jax grinned. That went better than I expected. Noah chuckled. Calm and facts, that's Ethan's way. Maya smiled. Now the real test will be the meeting with the residents. Ethan looked at the office behind them. He wasn't celebrating yet, but he felt a small measure of hope. They had been heard. The next step would decide if real change could come. As they walked to the car, several residents in the parking lot approached. Word had spread. One woman asked for a copy of the packet. Another man shook Ethan's hand. The sense of quiet momentum was building. Ethan climbed into the car and took a deep breath. The mission wasn't over. But they had taken the first step toward fairness. And sometimes, that was the hardest part. The 2 weeks leading up to the emergency meeting passed quickly. Word spread across the neighborhood, and almost everyone seemed aware that change was in the air. People who normally stayed quiet about community matters were suddenly talking on sidewalks, in driveways, and at the park. Ethan could feel the shift. Neighbors were no longer whispering about fines behind closed doors. They were ready to face them openly. On the evening of the meeting, the community hall was packed. Rows of folding chairs filled the room, and every seat was taken. Some people stood at the back, leaning against the walls. Families came together, couples held hands, and older residents sat with their grandchildren on their laps. There was a quiet buzz of anticipation, but also attention. People wanted answers. At the front sat the HOA board members, their nameplates lined neatly on the table. James, the property manager, looked tired but attentive. The board president, the older woman with the firm expression, shuffled papers nervously. The younger board member who had agreed to the meeting tapped his pen lightly, clearly thoughtful. Ethan, Noah, Jax, and Maya sat in the front row, their documents ready. Ethan had not prepared a long speech. He had only prepared honesty. The meeting began with the board president clearing her throat. Thank you all for attending. We are here to discuss concerns raised by residents regarding compliance enforcement. We ask for respect and order. A few people muttered under their breath, but the room quieted. James introduced Ethan. Mr. Cole has gathered information on behalf of several residents. He will begin. Ethan stood slowly, buttoning his jacket. He looked around the room, not at the board, but at the faces of his neighbors. He saw the elderly couple who had worried about their mailbox, the single mother who had been frightened, the young father who had thought of moving. He smiled gently. My name is Ethan Cole, he began. I've lived here for years. This is my home, just as it is yours. 2 weeks ago, men came to my door shouting that I was in violation. They handed me a fine with no clear reason. At first, I thought it was only me. But when I started talking to others, I realized it wasn't. He paused. I want to be clear, rules matter. Standards matter. We all want a safe, beautiful neighborhood. But fairness matters too. Respect matters. What we've seen recently has not been fair or respectful. Maya clicked the projector, showing the first slide of fines. The room gasped as identical slips appeared on the screen, row after row. Ethan continued, dozens of us have received notices like these. No bylaw references. No appeals. Just demands for money. The next slide showed the vendor contract. Noah stepped forward briefly. This contract pays the compliance company $50 for every violation they issue. In 6 months, they wrote over 300 citations. That's more than one for almost every home. The room filled with murmurs. People looked at each other in disbelief. Jax then spoke. We gathered anonymous stories from residents. Many said they felt pressured or frightened. Some paid even though they didn't understand what they had done wrong. This is not how a community should feel. Finally, Ethan concluded. We are not here to fight. We are here to ask for fairness. Suspend these questionable fines. Review each one carefully. Change the contract so enforcement is not based on profit. And create a process where notices are clear, respectful, and easy to appeal. We believe these changes will protect all of us, including this board. When Ethan finished, silence hung for a moment. Then hands began to rise. The elderly woman from the flower pot incident spoke first. They fined me for my porch decorations. I've had them for 10 years. I felt embarrassed, like I was breaking the law in my own home. Another resident stood. They came to my house after dark and scared my kids. That's not how you treat neighbors. The single mother's voice shook as she spoke. I paid money I couldn't afford because I didn't know what else to do. One by one, residents shared their experiences. Some were angry, others sad, but all carried the same message: they wanted fairness. The younger board member finally leaned forward. His voice was steady. We've heard enough to know change is needed. I propose suspending all recent fines until they can be reviewed. I also propose terminating the current vendor contract and rewriting it with new terms that remove poor enforcement incentives. The room erupted in applause. The board president looked overwhelmed but nodded. Very well. We will vote. The vote passed, 3-1. The questionable fines were suspended. A committee of residents would review them one by one. The contract would be renegotiated, and residents would help draft a new enforcement process. Notices would include bylaw numbers, clear explanations, and steps for appeal. Enforcement officers would no longer come unannounced to people's doors. For the first time in months, the community hall felt lighter. People clapped, smiled, and hugged. Neighbors who barely spoke before now shook hands. It was more than a decision, it was a turning point. After the meeting, residents surrounded Ethan, thanking him. He shook his head. This wasn't me. It was all of us. You spoke. You stood together. That's what made the difference. The single mother approached with her daughter, who held a small stuffed bunny. Thank you, she said softly. You made me feel safe again. Ethan crouched to the child's level and smiled. You should always feel safe at home. That's what we were protecting. Later that week, the HOA sent out a letter announcing the new changes. It was written in plain language and explained the new process step by step. For the first time, residents felt the rules were something they could understand and trust. A few board members stepped down, and new volunteers stepped up. Among them was the retired teacher who had kept the older bylaws. He joined Ethan and others to draft clearer, simpler rules. A sense of unity began to replace the tension that had divided the neighborhood. One Saturday afternoon, Ethan hosted a small gathering on his lawn. He set out pitchers of lemonade and plates of cookies. Children played tag while parents chatted under the shade of trees. The elderly couple brought flowers, the young father brought his guitar, and the single mother came with her daughter, who smiled shyly at everyone. Ethan stood back for a moment, watching. This was what he wanted from the beginning, not victory, not recognition, but community. Neighbors who trusted each other, who felt safe, who knew they could speak without fear. As the sun set, Jax clapped him on the shoulder. You did good, Ethan. Ethan shook his head with a small smile. We did good. All of us. That's what makes this home. And with that, the story of fines and intimidation transformed into a story of respect and reform. The lesson was clear: when people stand together calmly, with honesty and patience, they can change even the most difficult situations. Not with anger, not with force, but with fairness.